Well, maybe I should start with, ¿Cómo está ka? ¿Cómo estás? Well, thank you all for coming to our panel on Seduction of the Immigrant, Filipino Spanish Artists in 1970s American Comics. My name is N. Scott Robinson, and I'm going to start off with the Philippines and talk about some of the more famous names in Filipino comics. Some of these you may know from American comics, but what a lot of people don't know is what they were doing before they came to America. So one of the first important artists in Filipino comics is Tony Velasquez, who is known as the father of Filipino comics. He's kind of like the closest thing to a Stan Lee and a Jack Kirby in one in Filipino comics. He worked as early as 1931 in comics in the Philippines, and then went on to basically run one of the major publishers of Filipino comics in the 1940s. And this is an example of one of the first issues of that Ace Publications, Filipino Comics. We got a little feedback here, can we get that? Okay, great. This is an example of one of the early publications that Tony Velasquez worked on as an illustrator in 1931, the Liwawe. And some of the other artists like Nestor Redondo and Alfredo Alcala also worked in this magazine, which was not a comic, it was sort of a magazine with comics. And this is an example from a later issue in 1974 with some art by Alfredo Alcala. That's sort of the beginning of Tony his work in comics in the Philippines. Another one of the important artists from this period of comics as they developed in the Philippines is Francisco Coaching, and this example of special comics from Ace Publications as well in the 1950s. And then we get into some of the artists that actually got their start in the Philippines and then came to America. This is Alfredo Alcala, and then an independent publication, Fantastic Comics, where you could see the 1960, the level of detail in the art in the Filipino comics is seems much more developed than what was happening in America at this time. If you think of some of the big Marvel comics, the early Marvel comics, this is I think one of the contributions that the Filipino artists were contributing to the comic arts at this time in the Philippines. These are some other examples of Alcala's work in the 1950s with Ace Publications, Filipino Comics, and then its interior page. A lot of these artists that are known in America for superhero and horror and adventure had worked in a wide variety of genres in the Philippines: westerns, adventure, historical, romance, all kinds of things. Nestor Redondo, some of you may know that name from American comics, and here's a comic with his name in the title, Redondo Comics, and this is by a publisher known as Kraft Publications, and Kraft was initials of some of these Filipino artists. I'll talk about the significance of the publishers in a minute after I finish a brief introduction of some of the artists, but this is kind of in the horror style that some of these artists were known for in America. A couple other examples of Nestor Redondo's work, an interior shot. You can see the level of detail in the art, and another horror cover. And then this is an interior, even though it says Alcala on the cover, it's raw art by Nestor Redondo from the 1960s, before they came to America. And then, of course, Alex Niño, who many maybe know from American comics, and had got his start kind of late in the Philippines in the latter part of the 60s with the Kraft publishers, as well as Romeo Clemente Tonghal, who sometimes published with the pseudonym Brocleta, which is sort of a combination of his first initials. So if you don't know the pseudonyms that some of these artists use, sometimes it's hard to find and identify their work sort of pre-America. And then Tony DeZuniga is an interesting Filipino artist who had got a start in the Philippines in the 1950s doing covers and lettering for Liwawe magazine. But a lot of people don't know, so when he came to America in 1962, he was here studying commercial art right at the beginning of the Marvel superhero boom with Amazing Fantasy 15, Spider-Man 1, Fantastic Four, those kinds of things. So he sort of witnessed that directly and went back to the Philippines. But he's sort of like the linchpin that kind of came over and was the connection to the Philippines and got others involved with DC Comics and other publishers here. in the 1970s. So these are the artists. A couple other names like Ernie Chan and Ruby Nebres were also part of that wave of Filipinos that came over to America, and these are some examples of their work in the Philippines. The Ruby Nebres example here is actually a Filipino version of King Kong. But these are all sort of pre-coming to America. And these comics are rare, and they're sought after by collectors in the Philippines. Very hard to kind of get your hands on examples of work like this from these famous artists in America to try to find copies and get them. It's very difficult. Now, the publishers are important. Now, Ace Publications was started by Don Ramon Rosas and Tony Velasquez was basically the sole employee in 1947. They literally had a corner of an office with a typewriter and a desk, and Tony, he had an ID card that the manager signed, which was him, and then he, as employee, had to sign it. So he's the only employee of Ace Publications that has an ID card with, like, he signs it twice, and everybody else, it's his signature and someone else. The first series that they put out were in 1949, Filipino Comics. Francisco Coaching also worked on that. Later on, Nestor Redondo and Alfredo Alcala also worked with subsequent series that they had begun to publish. Interesting, some of these series that Ace Publications put out also included American comics, including the work of Jack Kirby by 1949, 1950. There were these Philippine editions of American comics in there, but most of the work they did was in Tagalog and local to the Philippines. The Ace Publications, unlike some of the other smaller publishers that would come and go before them, were highly successful. Not only were their comics very popular, they also included ads, and they went from, in a decade, 10,000 print run to 125,000. So with the ads taking care of the printing costs, the sales of the comics made the publisher quite popular and quite successful. In 1962, however, some of the rest of the production staff felt that they should be getting the same salaries as the illustrators and the writers, so there was this huge strike, and it shut down the publisher for good at that time. It was sort of the end of Ace Publications. After that, these are a couple examples of those series that were put out, Tagalog Classics, that featured some of the American comics, as well as indigenous, and then Hiwaga comics. After that, Craft Publications, this is the initials of some of the artists that started it. Tony Caravana, Nestor Redondo, and Alfredo Alcala, and Romeo Francisco. That's where the name Craft comes from. But it was mainly started by Nestor Redondo and his brother, and Alfredo Alcala and Amanda Castrillo were the ones that started it. And then other artists joined later, including people like Alex Niño and Jim Fernandez. This publication were not as successful commercially. They were a band of artists who were very skilled in what they did, and they were into experimenting and taking the art form further, as far as you could go. And they did things like wraparound covers for the first time that you'd ever seen, levels of detail on the artwork that had not been sort of seen before, particularly if you compare it with what's going on in America in 1962 with what you would see by Alfredo Alcala and some of the others. But they had rivalry, who was going to do the cover. So one of the things, the deals they made is like, well, we'll put your name on the series, Alcala Fight Comics or Redondo Comics. Somebody else didn't get a title, didn't get their name on a comic. And who's going to do the cover? It was things like that with poor distribution and a comic with no ads. Artistically, great idea, but financially they were not very successful as businessmen. So they didn't last beyond 1968, 5 or 6 series. So it sort of broke a lot of artistic ground, but then financially didn't last. One other publisher that's kind of tied, this is an example of the kind of detail that you might see in some of the series that these artists did. This is Alfredo Alcala's Voltar strip from his Fight Comics in 1963. Again, this is all pre-USA. Then one of the last publishers to maybe mention to sort of tie up the end of this is the publisher GASI, which stands for Graphic Arts Service Incorporated. This was started after the fold of Ace Publications, while some of the artists that worked there went on to form Craft. Tony Velasquez and his brother went on to manage GASI. And GASI did a variety of comics, but again, within a decade, things in the Philippines had changed. There was martial law and came in, and then censorship of media content, which included comics. Comics were mandated to be printed on very cheap paper, and even some of the content, it sort of tripled artistic freedom of the artists who had previously enjoyed this great experimentation with taking the art form further. That all of a sudden now they have to do, Marcos's wife's story and do it on really cheap paper. So at that point, Tony Velázquez retires, but he's such a revered figure in Filipino comics that he was given royalties to all sales of Gassy comics after that, as well as a large house on the or apartment on the premises, like rent-free for the rest of his life. So it's kind of an interesting story, what happened to him. So that's just a little introduction to what the artists were doing in the Philippines before this wave came over to America. And then my colleague Jim Thompson is going to talk about the significance of these artists in America.
Was that clapping for me? And I haven't even started yet? Okay, so we're going to talk about the wave. And I don't mean this wave when I say that. Marvel introduced just now a new Filipino superhero, and she's named The Wave, which I find incredibly ironic because we all know of the 1970s as being that first Filipino wave that changed the way we appreciate comics here. And it wouldn't have happened if not for Tony DeZuniga. He is the catalyst that caused all of that in terms of basically the recruitment of all of those artists. And when I say all of those artists, we're going to talk primarily about, if we were doing film, it would be like the big five and the little three. That's what they used to call the classic Hollywood studios. We all know the ones I'm going to talk about, but how many do you think came over or worked? 20? 30? There were 200 Filipino artists that worked for DC and Warren in that 1970 to 1979 or 80 period. But let's look at the catalyst first. So he started, Tony DeZuniga was already in New York working for an advertising agency. And he was bored with it. And so he walked in and met with Joe Orlando and got work immediately, both in mysteries and primarily in romance that first year of 1970. But 1970, he also did All-Star Western #2, which was a harbinger for things to come. As we all know, he's the co-creator of Jonah Hex, and also a year later of Black Orchid. This is the last page of the first story with Jonah Hex. You don't see his face until the very last page. I mean, not the disfigured face. It's an amazing story, and a lot of people don't go back and read that one. But there it is where the light hits and the shock of seeing his disfigured face for a central character in comics was quite something at the time. I want to talk about DeZuniga for just a minute in terms of his storytelling ability. Look at how good he is at building that story from panel to panel. I think he's underappreciated in terms of those skills. Also, and we're going to talk about this with many, many of the inkers of this period, but he's one of the best of that as well as of the other, of drawing his own pencils. What he did with John Buscema and something like Savage Sword of Conan, he was a regular on that. Or even the superhero stuff. This is Carmen Infantino that he's inking. And with him, I should add that he was also responsible for an artist collective called The Tribe. So often it might be credited to The Tribe rather than to him, although the style is clearly recognized as his work. Nestor Redondo, who might be arguably the best craftsman out of the bunch. And he started in 1971 doing primarily horror stories, and he develops even more and expands in terms of his work. Look at the innovative lack of borders and some of the way that he's doing it, very unusual for the time. What's interesting about Redondo also is that he came in not just through DeZuniga, but also he was recruited by Vincent Fago at Pendulum Press to do Classic Illustrated, and he brought in a lot of other Filipino artists to work on that, which were reprinted a few years later as Marvel Classic Comics, and that's where a lot of us might be familiar with them. But look at that Jekyll and Hyde. This, though, this was one of, he did 6 out of the 7 Rima the Jungle Girl, and the splashes on that, and just the sheer, the quality of the artwork, but also the detail of it was really an eye-opener at that time in 1974. It was a standout. But this also, he did the Bible in 1975, and it's a masterpiece visually. I don't know if you can really get a sense of it from the image, but again, it's a masterpiece, I think, of his work, and a real collector's item now. Alfredo Alcala would be the next real master in this. And younger than the rest of them, or one of the younger ones. He also helped with recruitment and started in 1972. He worked a lot in both war and in horror, and he had worked in the Philippines on something called Voltar, which was later reprinted, and this didn't happen very often. It was reprinted in the Work magazine, and was also creator of Kong the Untamed. He managed to do actual superhero work and work for Marvel, and just look at those pages in terms of he's such a distinctive force at the time. He was also quite an inker. Now, John Buscema didn't care for his inks, but that's always been one of my very favorite Conan illustrations of all time, as the soldier. I think and it really harkens back. This looks like it could be right out of the Filipino comics, doesn't it? My personal favorite out of these, Alex Niño, who was really interesting in terms of, in this context, because he was probably the least successful in the Philippines compared to the others when he came here. He'd only had modest success there. He did get a late start, but he was not nearly as well respected, and became probably the one that achieved the greatest international acclaim once he got to the United States. And I'm sorry, he was the one that was younger than the others. That made a difference because he was less exposed to the pre-World War II artists that were so essential to the other ones that we've talked about. Instead, Jess Joblimon, another Filipino, was his biggest influence. And he did, at the same time that Redondo was doing Rima, he was doing the backup story in that. But first he did Captain Fear in 1972, he was doing some horror, and he was also doing Rima in 1974. And I think that's when it really became clear that science fiction was one of his strongest niches. He did a couple of works for Unknown Worlds of Science Fiction that were adaptations that were just brilliant. One of them was Behold the Man, the other one was the Harlan Ellison TikTok story that is one of my personal favorites. And he also did some just masterworks for Warren, including this one from Rip Magazine. Beyond those five, you have the next level, and somebody who's one of the most prolific of the bunch, Ernie Chan, who was originally credited as Ernie Chaw because of a typographical error on his birth certificate, apparently. And he also, just like everybody else, started at DC doing horror. But eventually he went to work at Marvel almost exclusively, starting in the late 70s, I think it was, let's see, 1975 or so. Or 70s, 77, started really working for Marvel primarily, and soon became focused primarily on Conan. And just look at that detail on some of the Conan. This was a portfolio that was published in Savage Sword of Conan. He was also a really, really interesting inker. This would be by Jim Starlin over the Hulk and Man-Thing, and then that was Thor working with Simonson. And I think he's a standout for that, but of course is known primarily as an inker for his collaborations with John Buscema. Then there's Rudy Nebres, who came a little bit later, 1973, and really found himself of interest and fame more once he moved to Marvel and started working on Deadly Hands of Kung Fu. He was also an incredibly talented inker. This was where he was collaborating with John Buscema on his Marvel Super Special. He's actually inking in color in these works. So that's one, and Peter Ledger was the colorist, but Nebres was not called an inker in this. He was called a renderer because he was working in colored inks when he was doing these. And for anybody that hasn't seen the artwork on this, it's incredible. Look at those horses. I'm going to do some of the others fairly briefly, but they're names that were again doing an incredible amount of work for DC during this period. This is Jerry Talent, who's probably as big a name as some of the others at the time because of his work on The Phantom Stranger and also his association with Unknown Soldier. He started in 1973. And again, look at that whim of a phantom. He's got a tremendously distinctive style. And was always a pleasure to look at. And he took over The Phantom Stranger and did great work. Joan, and I apologize for butchering the names on virtually everyone that I've said so far. June Lufamia was another artist that came over and did very good work right off the bat for DC and the horror titles. But when he went in the early 80s to Warren, that's where he started doing it. Just unbelievably complicated and beautiful renderings for Warren. A lot of these guys, that's really where their work shined the most. E.R. Cruz probably did more work for DC than almost any of the others. I think it was over 200 strips at DC during this time. Primarily working in, he did the most war comics of any of those. He also did some classics. He did Gulliver's Travels and Tom Sawyer and such. But he also got to do the last 3 issues of The Shadow, the Kaluta Shadow, after Frank Robbins left. He took over and did just, they're beautiful, all 3 issues of that. How am I doing time-wise? I'm moving. This is Rudy Flores, who did Korak, Tarzan Family. This is Noli Penelgan and Ruben, who's known as Rubeni, Ruben Yandok. Again, just I don't mean to fly through those, but Penelgan took over Jonah Hex after DeZuniga left. Nestor Redondo in Ghost. Gentleman who I mentioned. Look at what he's doing there. Very sophisticated work. Adrian Gonzalez, another one who was actually doing much more cartoony work, very different from the rest of the Filipino artists. And then Anton Caravana, who died tragically early in life, and if he hadn't, he'd probably be recognized at the same level that Alex Niño and some of the others. He was at the time of this in Vampirella 100. He was winning all kinds of awards and was being heavily honored. And my time is up, and I'm going to go back, and I'll see you in a few minutes.
So anytime there's a new workforce that comes into the United States from other countries, there's always some tension that happens with the American artists at the time. So what does that mean, and the flow of money? So essentially in 1970, Neil Adams starts off the Academy of Comic Book Arts, and meant for it to be some sort of comic book union to have better pay, better health insurance, keep the original art, things like that. Things that we take for granted now, but didn't have then. So Carmine Infantino was part of this academy, and he left that academy because he was in the corporate level of DC Comics, and he became publisher in 1971. So what happens is there's this growing need for unions, and so what does the publisher of DC Comics do? Carmine, Tony DeZuniga approached him, and he'd already been at DC for a year, and says, well, I have a lot of Filipino artists back where I'm from. If you want, you can use some of these artists instead of these the ones that want a union. So Tony DeZuniga and Carmine Infantino and Joe Orlando flew to the Philippines and met the guys that have already been mentioned. And Carmine mentions in his autobiography that the conditions they were living there's quite a bit of poverty. Some of the artists showed up with these incredible pages, but couldn't even afford shoes. So it was a really tough kind of environment for them, but they wanted to be famous, they wanted to be known in the United States. So then afterward, then Carmine starts using some of these artists, and Tony DeZuniga sets up a shop with his wife. And there's a lot of stories about Tony DeZuniga's wife out there, but the one that is here, what happens is Carmine paid $50 per page to the Tony DeZuniga shop, and he thought that $5 the DeZunigas would keep, and the artist making the page would get $45. But the opposite ended up happening, where Tony DeZuniga's wife kept the $45 and would give the artist $5. Eventually, artists started complaining. They were starting to move into the United States because they got more money. But Nestor Redondo complains to Carmine about this, and Carmine says in his autobiography that he did not know about that. And he calls Tony DeZuniga's shop, and his wife picks up, and she says, well, stay out of it. It's none of your business, because these artists wouldn't know what to do with all that money anyway. So it's kind of mean. But so this is in Carmine's autobiography, and there's 4 pages on this, and it's really interesting. But eventually the Filipino artists moved to the United States and joined the American comic artist workforce. And the impetus to deflate the unionization of the comic book artists, that did work. And so there's more artists, and the union efforts fell apart. So that's one of the things that was a consequence of this, and that's the money section of this stuff. Okay. All right.
In the Philippines, you see the decline of the big publishers due to some of the cultural climate and martial law and censorship. The economic lure of the United States, much stronger economy than the Philippines at that time, and then this impact of the Filipino wave on the effort to unionize. Another interesting outcome of that is the kind of Philippine editions of DC Comics that started to appear in 1971 in the Philippines by bookstores like Goodwill National Bookstore, and later on, at the end of the 70s, Alomar. This is one of the Philippine editions of Batman, where in the inside cover, it's got letters to the readers announcing that they're now going to be printing DC Comics in the Philippines. So it's an interesting, if not a direct relationship, but an indirect outcome of the Philippine and American artists and comic companies working together. Now, if we move to the Spanish wave of artists, I'm going to go very quickly over just an introduction of some of these artists to get Alex back up here, but it's sort of centered on the connection with this man, José Tutain Villa, who's also known as José Tutain. He worked originally in Spain as an illustrator and a writer and an enterprising comic businessman in Spain, and he formed a studio of artists called Seduction he's pioneering in not only getting them work in Spain, but working internationally in places like France and England and eventually in America. So it's a very lucrative career that he had. This is an example of one of his newspaper strips in the 50s. But he went on to manage a lot of these artists in his studio. Now, some of you may know the names like Enrich or Sanjulián or Pepe González, but if you look at the examples of the types of material that they did in Spain, it's kind of plain in comparison to what they did in America. These are some American comics that came into Spain in the 1960s, and there was a law in Spain that you had to, you couldn't wholly reproduce material that was published elsewhere. If you were going to publish that material, the covers had to be redrawn. That helped keep some of the local artists working as more and more of this material came in. But a lot of these artists were doing indigenous work, like Pepe Gonzalez, very famous for Vampirella, but he did this kind of children's literature, romance comics. He's known for the kind of depicting feminine beauty in his style. Luis Garcia Moses is another one that worked a lot in romance comics. He started at 14 years of age with Editorial Bruguera, and at 16 he joined the Selecciones Ilustradas and worked often in British comics until the late 60s, where he collaborated with Esteban Maroto on the famous sci-fi strip Cinco por Infinito that began in 1968 in a comic in Spain called Delta 99. This was sort of extremely different from all the other material these artists were involved with. Esteban Muroto wasn't really a cover artist. His material originally appeared in the Delta 99 comic, but Fernando Fernandez did a lot of the covers, but his material was reprinted, Wolf the Barbarian strip and Cinco por Infinito, in comics like Dracula and other reprints with Muroto's artwork on the covers. But he didn't really primarily work as a cover artist in the 60s. Sanjulián, very famous with Warren, but this is kind of innocuous material that he did in Spain at this time, where there was a military dictatorship, a kind of an effort to homogenize Spain, nationally speaking, promotion of Catholic values. So these artists, they were working under that kind of climate, almost like what happened in the Philippines in the 70s with the censorship there and the more harsher political climate. Auraleón also worked at British comics, westerns, romance, things of that nature, war comics, and José María Bellafont, who's also should be known as the artist with a million names. My personal favorite is just the letter B. If you don't know the pseudonyms of some of these artists, it's hard to find their pre-US material. And then the great Fernando Fernandez, but again, some of this material is not as outstanding as what you would see in the US. But these are some of the examples of the late 60s where it started to get a little bit more fantasy sci-fi. And then Martin Salvador, who also did lots of westerns in the 1950s. So it's similar to Spain that there is this kind of political cultural oppression that these artists are working under. And of course, Spain had progressed economically at that time, but it was also behind the US, so that the lure of the American dollar is there. And then the other thing that's interesting about these Spanish artists is this sort of successful international spread of their work in places like France, England, Spain, and the United States. I'll let our colleague Alex Grant take over about the artists in America.
All right, so this, the Spanish artists, when they hit America, visually they completely changed their styles because there's essentially no more filter on them. So it all starts with James Warren, and again, it's a bit of a money talk, but basically, like DC, Carmen Infantino, they had to play kind of two sets of less monetary charged people against each other to keep them as a hegemon. But James Warren was different. He was a small business, always short on cash, taking on the big publishers. He had a $250,000 printing debt, but he started to see some of the Spanish artists when he reprinted in 1967 a British romance comic that had Fleetway British material called Teen Love Stories, and it had a bunch of Spanish artists in there. So it was through those British romance comics that he found them. And also Marvel and Skywald publications were releasing black and white comic magazines to compete with him. So Skywald was started by Saul Brodsky, who left Marvel to do this, and Marvel started releasing black and white magazines too, like Savage Sword of Conan and other things. So James Warren was feeling a lot of pressure. And there was a couple other things, because also Frank Frazetta, who would do a lot of his covers in the 60s, was getting a lot more expensive. A lot of EC Comics artists were retiring or leaving or going to newspaper strips. So he was just running out of artists, and he's low on money. And so then enter Joseph Tutain, who they looked at business and comics in the same similar sort of way. And he had already approached Carmine and Stanley to use some of his Spanish artists. They said, I'll think about it. And so then he meets Jim Warren. Jim Warren remembers him from the romance comics he reprinted, and says, well, this sounds like a good deal. How about I get first dibs on your Spanish artist, and I will give you an international license to do Warren magazine things in Spain and European countries. So they found a good deal with each other, and then introduced various artists into the American scene. The first one is Enrich. He was born in Barcelona. One of his main things is he was a fine painter artist. He was inspired by lighting from Rembrandt, and he would put that into his covers. So he illustrated 52 lifelike Vampirella covers, and he was considered the ultimate Vampirella cover artist. And so these are some of the examples of his artwork. And I mean, they look like painting quality, but these were on magazine stands. And you can see that he uses like lighting, like a lot of the other artists will use shading, but he uses like as if there's a spotlight coming from a certain angle. And it's pretty impressive stuff, and these are various covers from the 70s. Here's another couple of them, Vampirella 53 and 27, and he really brings the character to life, more so probably than, it's sacrilege, but maybe more than Frank Frazetta did. But it's really impressive covers. And when you look at it, he just brings like a photorealism to the character where you really feel like, wow, I feel like I'm in the same room with this character. And there's a lot of young men collecting this magazine that wish they were in the same room with the cover character. But he also did other things. He did the cover of a Skywald Psycho, which again uses that lighting technique on the female character. And he even did book covers for Bantam, like this Star Trek cover, which again, the photorealism is really amazing. So the next guy is José González Navarro, and he was one of the artists in that 1967 British romance comic, and James Warren loved his artwork so much that although Frank Frazetta was the best US comic artist under the James Warren Awards in 1970, José González was the one from 1971. And he often had Carol DeHaro, who was the girlfriend of one of the other artists, Luis Garcia Moses, as a reference for Vampirella. And so James Warren said in an interview that nobody got Vampirella right until José González depicted her. And what's amazing about this picture of Vampirella here is that José González penciled it, and then Enrique, the previous artist, painted it. So it's considered the perfect Vampirella image. These are some examples of some of the interiors that José González would do. And you could see, I mean, this is just really incredible stuff. You don't really see this in some of the other comics. I mean, sometimes some people compare it to Mark Silvestri's Uncanny X-Men run, but this is just the penciling and the symbolism. It's like romance comics on steroids, just completely insane, with a horror sensuality. And here's some more, and you can see that he really makes it. Jim Warren really wanted to turn up the scale on the sexy factor for the newsstands. He said, look, this is going to sell because I got to compete with Marvel and Skywald. I really got to turn up the volume on these things. And so the Spanish artists were just completely unleashed through this market. And there's no comics code for this, so the black and white magazines could do kind of adult to an extent. So the next guy is Luis Garcia Moses, and he was influenced by Alex Raymond and Noel Sickles, and he would use a lot of photorealistic shading. He was also experienced in the British romance comics, and that's the theme, is British romance comics. A lot of this is almost like a prerequisite to be in this crowd. But this was his girlfriend, Carol DeHaro, who would pose as Vampirella, and both Luis Garcia Moses and Carol were both models, so that's both of them on the cover of a magazine. You could see that the shading is really interesting here, and it's different from the Enrich lighting technique. This is more shading, and it's casting shadows, and the photorealism. So James Warren did say that we found our second Jose Gonzalez. We found our second one, all right. And these panels are just really incredible. And just imagine, you're seeing, Fantastic Four, or you're seeing Superman, and you see this, and you're like, whoa, I want to buy more of these. So this was a big deal in the 70s. So the next one is Esteban Maroto, and he's also an interior penciler. He was known for sword and sorcery comics, and Jim Warren definitely needed something to compete with Savage Sword of Conan. And so he was an artist for 101 Warren stories. 2 of them were Vampirella, and he was known for drawing outside of panels to depict dreamlike imagery. And you could see that this is his wolf comic that was more his European sword and sorcery character, but then they would reprint these in Eerie magazine for Dax the Warrior. And that was Jim Warren's answer to Marvel's Black and White Conan magazine, which was super successful. Also, you have more Esteban Muroto, where he would do more sword and sorcery stuff, but every now and then he would do something different from that, like this science fiction story in Creepy 73, Last Light of the Universe. Vampirella 67 has this really nice, again, sword and sorcery type, but it was also colored. So if you ever see a colored issue, you want to keep those because they're really beautiful. Sanjulián, he was a high quality painter. He would do covers. Again, it's all about getting something as good as Frank Frazetta, but at lesser cost, because Frank Frazetta was so much in demand by the time the 70s hit. And he was internationally known specialist in painted cover illustration in Europe, USA. He would do magazine covers, book covers, he did everything. And if you just look, it's such a long list. Eerie, Creepy, Vampirella, 1984, Famous Monsters of Filmland, book covers, Ace, Avon, Bantam, Dell. And it was essentially, the concept is Frank Frazetta artwork, but at a lower cost. That's how Jim Warren looked at it, and because he had to run a business. And so you see the different covers, and they're just really outstanding images. Of these other 2 from 1972, you have Eerie, Vampirella. He would do various covers, and each one just had these almost surreal, but still photorealistic images. A couple more from 1976. I like this title, Buck Blaster and Thelma Starbust. I mean, what kind of 70s movie would that be? Then he also did book covers, like we mentioned before, so The Spell of Conan and Worms of the Earth. And then that takes us to Raphael Auraleón, and he was a penciler, interior penciler. He was experienced at various genres in Europe. He was famous for illustrating Warren painting horror stories like Vampirella, Creepy, and Eerie. Interesting thing about him is a lot of his images, if you look closely, there's almost very depressed imagery. The characters have bags under their eyes, none of them are really smiling. And he committed suicide in 1993 at the age of 53. So you just look closely at him and you see that there's some despondence in the imagery here, and it's interesting to analyze. José María Bea. He was a Parisian-trained painter and a British romance comics artist. He was unique in that he both wrote and illustrated his stories. So his first story was Vampirella 13, and he did 32 Warren stories and 2 covers. And this is his first story in 1971, The Silver Thief and the Pharaoh's Daughter. And you could see elements of British romance comics with the way the pharaoh's faces are and the way the women are portrayed. There's a certain almost classical beauty to the characters. This is Creepy 65 on the left and Eerie 76 on the right. And again, the imagery is just really beautiful. He could do anything. He was a bit of a Renaissance man when it came to his different artistic styles. Fernando Fernandez was experienced in British Warren romance comics, and he again was also another one that was a writer and artist. He started in 1973, but look at these layouts. They're just so dreamlike, and they go beyond the panels. And it tells a lot. They're almost like these figurative, metaphorical pages. This is Vampirella 40, and you can see that he would use paneling in a really clever way. And then Memoirs, which just shows like the anguish of the main character in the story. This is Vampirella 36, again, another of these rare, more colored images, but beautiful sense of femininity in his artwork. Santiago Martin Salvador, he also worked for Warren through Joseph Tutane. He both penciled and inked, and he was known for using shading to establish mood, atmosphere, and texture, where if you look at these images, you really feel like you're in these places. Really fun stuff to look at, and it's easy to just get lost in the pages. So, okay, this is Jim.
Super quick, so we'll have a chance for questions. There's a couple of legacy points that I want to talk about the Spanish artist. One is that it went way past when Warren actually had filed bankruptcy and went out. It continued because they kept it alive in Spain, and they were using not just the Spanish artists, but they had a license agreement with Warren. So artists like Alex Toth and Corbin and some of the others were spread throughout Europe because of the contractual relationships they had sown with Warren, because the agency went into publishing, and so you had these books like 1984 and Creepy. These are not the Warren ones, these are the Spanish publications. The other point I want to make is in terms of its effect on American comics, and you mentioned it with Silvestri. Some Image would not have existed in the same way if not for these Spanish artists like Maroto, because what happens is they become sexier, they become and unfortunately perhaps maybe less coherent in terms of storytelling, which was always the critique of the Spanish artists at Warren, and also the critique of those early years at Image, when the focus is much more on the eye candy aspect than on the storytelling aspect. And that's something we sort of also owe to the Spanish artists of the Warren era. And now we're going to open it up to questions.
Anyone have a question? Yes. So the sources for all of us, or? Sure. Well, I am, my primary area of investigation is international comics, so I'm always interested in looking for what kind of comics were published in different parts of the world. There's some 105 areas in 88 languages. So the opportunity to do this panel, I knew these names, but I did not know what they had done, so I started to investigate them through fellow collectors and online sources to find this material, and I was really surprised that a lot of it was quite different from what they had done in America.
It's all upstairs for me, and I mean literally upstairs in my house. This was my era, so I was pretty well acquainted with it, but again, I was surprised by just how many of them were from the Philippines. That was my only point of real discovery.
There's some good text on the Spanish illustrators, and I also have every Warren magazine pretty much. On the comic book unionization talk, that's in the Carmine Infantino autobiography that was put out by Vanguard Publications, written by J. David Spurlock.
I would also say the Warren book on this is very good, and there was a recent book on Spanish illustrators that I thought was very nice. I wish it had an index, but it's very nice.
In the back there?
And I'm not aware of any in regards to either of those waves.
Right, yeah, because in the Spanish illustrators, Joseph Tutane's Selecciones Ilustrada was essentially men artists, really, and that was more probably a product of the Spanish environment in the 50s and 60s when that was founded.
Out of time, so we'd like to thank you all for coming, but if you'd like to be in touch, we have a variety of social media contact us for more information. But thank you all for coming.